torn apart by horses, surrounded by hundreds at the left, thousands at the right. How can you forget? Prophesy before your eyes, it will come to pass. It said, do honor me, obey all his commands, lest ye forget. Lest ye forget.
The date is August 21st, 1831, on a silent summer evening. Inspired by signs from God, Nat Turner leads a revolutionary slave rebellion that sent shockwaves to Southampton County, Virginia. Going from plantation to plantation, murdering the white slave owners and setting free the slaves, recruiting them to his army with each conquest on a holy mission of freedom. Was he the enraged murderer that the media portrayed him to be? Was he merely inspired by the dream of freedom, like so many slaves often were? Was he driven by divine purpose? What revelations did Nat see in the Holy Bible? Who was Nat Turner? Join us as we answer these questions and many more. Nat Turner, the slave, the prophet, the hero.
I'm proud of my heritage in Nat Turner, and I'm proud of the fact that I've inherited the legacy of which he passed down. And in doing so, that means that I have to accept everything that happened. A lot of Black people do not like to accept the fact that they have a slave background, a slave history. I embrace my slave history very well. And the principles that Nat fought for, liberty, honor, equality, those are the principles that I still hold to today. And so, yes, I'm very pleased with that. Nat is in my lineage. I'm very pleased to pass that on. I have grandchildren, and I try to instill into them. I use a statement that he used to use, a three little word was his motto, all here now. Nat wanted all people to be free, not just himself. He wanted all people in the Black race to be free. He wanted them to be free here, or wherever they live, not in some faraway land or back to Africa. And he wanted them to have it now. He tried to do it on August 22, 1831. He wasn't successful, but he did lay that seed. And today, I live here in Virginia, which is the home state of Nat Turner. I have all of my rights and all of my freedoms. I have all of them right here, and I have all of them now. My grandchildren will have those, and hopefully my great-grands and my great-great-grands and those who follow. So the legacy of Nat Turner, what he fought for, will go on for a lot of generations. First question is, Nat did not just seek to free his people through a violent rebellion. He has spent many of his early years freeing people, particularly freeing their mind and freeing their soul through his preaching of the Bible, through his embracement of the Christian religion, and he tirelessly sought to bring that to the slaves. He was well known for many years in the Southampton County area as a preacher of the gospel. So in that sense, he was already rebelling long before he struck his first blow, because he was giving people an outlet. He was bringing something to the slaves that they did not get every day, and particularly did not get from their masters. He educated himself. He could read and write. So he freed his mind to think beyond the boundaries of which was just his physical boundaries. As far as we know, he never left Southampton County, but his mind covered areas far beyond that. And then so he passed that on to other people as well. So he gave religious freedom to the slaves. Then he brought the freedom of education by freeing their minds and encouraging them to better themselves. And then as a last resort, when he was given directions that he said he received from God, he also used violence. The violence is the only one in which that we know about that's primarily passed through history, which we focus on. But it was only one small piece, because it was only 3 days. When you measure 3 days against a lifetime of other actions, you see that Nat Turner didn't just bring freedom or try to bring freedom through physical, he also brought it through the mind and through all the other areas. He sought to free the whole slave, not just take away the chains.
There were other slave rebellions prior to Nat Turner in 1831. However, Nat Turner was the most successful open rebellion. You have rebellions like the Gabriel Prosser of Virginia. You have Denmark Vesey of South Carolina. Those rebellions were suppressed before it even happened. Okay, because you had house Negroes that would leak out the information, and the masters found out what was going on and they suppressed it. Nat Turner, on the other hand, he was successful. Now, what do I mean by successful? Successful as far as the casualties that he was able to bring forth on the slave masters and the other whites who owned slaves on the other plantations. He was unsuccessful as far as bringing freedom to the majority of his people, because as a result of the insurrection, a lot of them were put to death.
Nat started preaching the gospel as early as age 15, when he was under the ownership of his owner, which is named Samuel Turner. Samuel Turner was a Methodist, as was Benjamin Turner, Nat's original owner. And all 4 of his owners were Methodists. So he had an indoctrination into the Methodist religion or the Methodist practices. He was also influenced by Quakers. Quakers were very strong in that area, and they also were opposed to slavery. Nat was known to preach in at least about 5 or 6 different locations. He was allowed to preach to slaves outside in the back of a church. He was not allowed to go inside the church, but he could preach to slaves outside. He traveled around to different places. In May of 1825, Nat was baptized. He and a white man named Edward Brantley, baptized each other in front of a large crowd of both blacks and whites. Baptism to Nat was his way of solidifying his closeness with God, his relationship with God, and he felt that gave him the de facto directions or authority to bring salvation to the people in the area. He baptized many people in those various points around there down in South Hampton County. Some of the locations was Cabin Pond, Pearson's Pond, Rivers Mill, Oaks Pond. There are names that still exist today down in South Hampton County. So, like I say, he was administering to the black population to bring religion, to free their souls, so that they would know there was something other than just slavery. His first step into prophesizing is that he said that one day when he was, as a child, he was playing with children. He started telling them a story about something that had happened. And the adults said that they knew that had happened before he was born. And one of the elders of the plantation, most likely it was on Benjamin Turner's plantation, said that anyone who could tell a story before they had happened, they had to have had an insight from God, and that made him a prophet. And as a young child, the word prophet had obviously had a significant meaning for that. Whether he had already read about prophets in the Bible, he may already have. And so by someone telling him that he was a prophet, he decided that was his direction that he would take. And so he spent his life trying to live up to the prophecy. In his confessions, he said he would fast, he would spend time away alone and commune with God, that he would go out and seek redemption for any of the past sins that he may have committed. He tried to live a very moral life. He didn't carry money on him. He never sought material gains. And he was known by everyone to be truthful, didn't tell lies. He didn't speak sexual favors, nor would he blaspheme against his neighbors.
Since a child, Nat Turner knew that he was ordained to be a prophet. He knew that this was his destiny. When you read the Confessions of Nat Turner, he always quoted the Bible. He used the Bible as fuel for insurrection. All right, and his idol, I should say, for lack of better words, was Jesus Christ. Now, when you are reading the New Testament, when the Pharisees and scribes turned on Christ and the Roman soldiers came along with Judas to take Christ, Christ didn't fight back. Christ willingly gave himself up for his people. The same thing with Nat Turner, because when you read the Confessions, remember, Nat Turner ran away from one of his plantation owners. But he realized what he was destined for, and he returned back to the plantation where he ran away from. He didn't get caught. He willfully returned back because he knew his destiny. What was his destiny? His destiny was to plan an insurrection and try to fight for freedom. He realized the impact that he would have on the minds of the other slaves, even the ones that didn't join the insurrection, right? Because that's what a leader does. A leader takes action. The slaves were tired of their condition. They were tired of their state. Therefore, they had to rebel. All right, and Nat Turner was the man to lead that charge. So prior to the insurrection, did Nat Turner have like a history of being like, bad on the slave plantation or rebellious slave?
No, it was actually well liked by all of that it was given on him, by all of his masters. He was given a lot of freedom to be a preacher. He started preaching the gospel as early as probably about 15 or 16 years old.
Wow. So Nat Turner started preaching the gospel at 15 years.
Yeah, it was early. That's what the estimated time was 15. He during his ownership under Samuel Turner, he preached around there to the slaves. Both Samuel and Benjamin went through a lot of effort to make sure that their slaves got religion. Even schooling, it's believed that Benjamin allowed Nat to take classes with his children at a schoolhouse that he ran on the plantation.
Wow.
And there's no actual record of that, but Nat said that he never knew how he learned to read and write, but he had grown up knowing how to read and write, as well as to work numbers. So the logical conclusion is that he took lessons along with Benjamin Turner's children, most likely along with John Clark Turner. And John Clark Turner was known to be Nat Turner's close friend. So much so that during the insurrection, Nat deliberately avoided John Clark Turner's farm and killing him when he could have. And it was later on that it was on the farm. John Clark Turner's farm is the farm that Fanny Turner was born on, who was my great grandmother. That's the way the family was from Fanny. The line passed on down. So there's every indication that Nat was a well-liked, a well-thought-of person growing up. He ran away from Samuel Turner once. He said that he ran away after mistreatment from an overseer, but he came back after 30 days. And there's no indication that there was never any records that was ever found of like a wanted poster or anything else. So Samuel Turner trusted him to come back, or just assumed Nat would come back, because at that time he probably already was either married to Sherry, or because his mother was still living on the farm. They knew he would come back.
So he had a good relationship with the slave masters.
He had a good relationship with the slave masters. When he was under Tom Moore allowed him not only to continue to preach, but also to hire himself out to work as a carpenter to other farms. And Joseph Travis continued up that same trend. Joseph Travis was a carriage maker by trade, more so than a farmer. So Nat was allowed to be the semi-overseer. I guess today you would call him a working boss to the other slaves on the farm. He'd make sure that the farm work got done. I strongly believe that he believed that he was inspired by God. His statements that he gave were definitely statements that a person felt that they had been directed. It was not something that he just conjured up on his own to explain his actions later on. His life that he led showed that he obviously had full commitment to the words that he received. If you take back to your time and try to imagine what it was like, a person who had to work every day for someone else, who had to be owned by someone else, who had no real freedoms of his own. And here he's receiving the directions that he says come to him, come only to him. And then he tries to balance his life to those directions as opposed to what he mastered. I would say that he definitely had full belief that he was tapped and ordained by God, the Spirit of God, to do the things that he did. And that was that his life was to be in their hands. Even when the insurrection came about, he knew that the most likely that he would fail and that death would come to him. But he was compelled by that belief that he was chosen. In his confessions, he said he was shown visions. He just didn't get voices or get words spoken to him. He was given visions. And in some of those visions, he saw people, black and white, of all colors and races, mixing without chains. He saw signs in the heavens stretched out across the sky that said that there was changes to come and there was different, better times ahead. He saw signs in the woods and on the leaves and the trees. He even saw signs of, say, blood on the coin. That's what a lot of people refer to as the impetus for his rebellion. But I think what that blood on the coin was actually that he was seeing given to him would be the last sacrament, the blood of Christ. Been passed down to him because he said in one of his statements was that the Spirit had told him to set loose the serpent and to slay his oppressors, and that it was time for him to lift up the yoke and carry on his process. So that was through all the these happened before the insurrection had occurred years ago. So he was following what he felt was given divine inspiration. He was being shown the way changes to this beyond this slavery, which made him stand out uniquely above slaves because most slaves could only see the row of corn in front of them or the work that they were doing. He was seeing beyond himself and beyond even his own lifetime.
That kind of role model would be Christ. Like I said, that kind of always quoted Christ in the Bible. And we know Christ had spiritual gifts. He was born, the Messiah, he was the Savior. And that kind of understood. That Turner's parents, his mother, told him that he was ordained with some great purpose and great destiny. So with that influence on that, some of that influence on his actions and so forth. He never hung out amongst the other slaves. He would separate himself, he would fast, he would pray often, right? And he would indulge himself in prophecies and scripture. So Nat Turner understood that he was ordained from his youth to be a prophet of God, not only a prophet of God, but to bring forth liberation to his people. He was a savior for our people in that time.
He was referring to the white oppressors, to the slave owners. And he said that he would rise up and slay them with their own weapons. And in doing so, that he would take on the yoke that Christ had borne to bring the freedom to man. So Nat was feeling that his actions was now he was taking the position when Christ came to the world was to take away the sins of man and to bring redemption to man. So Nat felt that he was also following in that same line, that he was the next person chosen to do that. And his, again, referring back to his confessions, Nat said that there was one particular passage in the Bible that he always carried with him. That was from the book of Matthew, seek ye the kingdom of heaven, and all things shall be added unto you. He said he developed his life around that. When he would do his prayers, he spent his time in fasting and study. He always referred back to that particular passage, seek ye the kingdom of heaven, and all things shall be added unto you. So those, he also quoted other biblical structures, like for instance, when he had escaped from Tom Moore, he stayed away for 30 days, but then he came back of his own accord and gave himself back to his master. And when the slaves asked him, why did he come back when he was already free? He said that he quoted that the person who does not do his master's will, or know his master's will and do it, shall be flogged with many stripes. So again, he was using the Bible to justify some of his actions. Or I'm very sure that throughout his life, whatever he did, he used the passages and the learnings that he had picked up in the Bible as a means of explaining his behavior. Nat's ultimate goal of the insurrection was to get to Jerusalem. There was an armory of arms there. Jerusalem as the town. Okay. In that town, there was an army, like in most all other towns, that the whites militias maintained their weapons, rifles, powder, cannons. And Nat, as he moved through the countryside with his building his army, his final goal was to get to Jerusalem, seize that armory, and then fortify the city and build it up with a large army of slaves. from that, he would grow an even bigger army and then eventually force the white government to agree to end slavery. In Jerusalem, I think he had that has maybe even become, say, the capital of the new Virginia without slavery, just as Jerusalem is the central capital of the Judeo-Christian religion. So from that, Jerusalem had a very, very significant impact in that term. But the accident of history, or say the accident of coincidence, Jerusalem was not that significant in the overall scheme of things. And the reason the name was changed from Jerusalem to Cortland, according to their history, was that's where the central courthouse was, the circuit court. And so as to identify that there was the court, the court seat was in the county, they changed the name to Cortland.
As a leader of the people, you got to go above and beyond. You got to separate yourself. You got to do things that the norm, outside of the norm, I should say. None of the other slaves were praying and fasting often. None of the other slaves were separating themselves and studying the prophecies and the scriptures and so forth. Nat Turner understood this. He understood his mission. Because remember, it was implanted in him since he was a little kid from his mother and his grandmother. They told him that he was ordained to be a prophet from his youth. So that always resonated and stayed in the mind of Nat Turner. So what did he do? He started doing things that a prophet does. When you read the scriptures, that's what the prophets did. They didn't entertain things in the world, right? And they were always praying and fasting. Nat Turner understood that the kingdom that it was referring to was the kingdom to come. He understood that the kingdom that he was in was the kingdom of the so-called white man. The so-called white man is his rulership on the planet Earth. So that's why he would always say, seek ye the kingdom. In order to seek ye the kingdom is not to go looking for it somewhere in a bush or just open the Bible and read scriptures over there. God requires actions, all right? Scripture in the Bible where it says God is a man of action. By him, actions are weighed, all right? So Nat Turner understood that. In order for him to bring forth the kingdom, he would have to do something. At that time, for that time period, his actions was the insurrection, overthrowing the so-called white man who was oppressing his people. That's why he always referred to that particular scripture. He understood that God was talking about action.
Nat said that in the earliest days when he began to embrace the religion, the other slaves recognized in him a set of singularity that he had a vision, so to speak, which they knew that he was separate from the rest of everyone else. And that said that he did not try to change the minds or the whole people's minds through conjuring or using voodoo or anything like that. He only taught through his preaching the words of God. And that as he ministered to the people, as he was developing his plan, he came up with a system that where he would give out various little pieces of information, coded words. Now, what those coded words were, we don't know. But he said that he passed along coded messages to the slaves to get them prepared for the day when their freedom or when the great day of redemption would come. He did it through his preaching, through his sermons. I mean, he may have done it through song. One of the things that in the Turner family today, almost all of us are atonal. You cannot carry a tone. I like to think that Nat Turner didn't have that affliction, that he probably could sing very well, or at least he could sing well enough that people would listen to it. He was known to have a very loud, booming voice, and that he would preach very fiery sermons. So that means that he could hold the attentions of the crowd. In that, it said that also he prepared people not only for the actions that he was going to take, he was preparing people for their soul that would happen afterwards. So Nat held sway over the population through his embracement of the religion. And his objective was to prepare people so they would be ready. Now, he only told 4 people what his original plan was. And when he made up his first plan, he didn't tell anyone except his wife. And he took in, on his first group of confidence with 4 people. Their names were Henry, Hawk, Jack, and Sam. And then when he started the insurrection, he brought in 2 more people, Will and Nelson. So with that, from that base, Nat kept everybody in the dark, so to speak, about what his goal was. And they didn't even know what his original goal was or what his objective was to get to Jerusalem when the insurrection started. He never told the slaves what his overall goal was. He kept it totally to himself. But he was able to hold sway over them through the force of his mind and through the force of what he had taught them through the religion. The Methodist means of religion is similar. Their rituals are very similar to Baptists. And so whether Nat was a Methodist by his training or whether he was a Baptist by his training, I can't say for sure. But he did follow what he had learned in the Bible, and both of them lean heavily on the New Testament as well as teachings from the Old Testament. But by all indications, Nat wanted the white people to know why he did what he did. He spoke of his own free accord with his confessions there that he wanted that information to be passed on. He just didn't want to die an anonymous death. And the fact that he hid for almost 2 months, for 74 days after the insurrection, without being captured. And then when he was captured, he was captured by just one person. That to me says that Nat had it in his mind, or is either a direction from God that he needed to speak, that he needed to pass on to the next generations. And I'm glad he did, because without that confession, we would have almost no real true knowledge of his thoughts. And in that confessions, if you read it very carefully, you can get a very good picture of Nat's true thoughts, that he was a very thoughtful, learned man. His actions were not that of a rash rebel, rebelling against harsh treatment. He was deliberate in what he did. He was deliberate in his intentions, and he was deliberate in what the results was to be. So families, people can come in here, they can do it, and a lot of it, you have to just sit here sometimes and just go through books after books after books and land deeds, and then you get into wheelings over here. But all these records are the records of the county, which is a treasure trove. And it just so happened because it happened here that history was preserved.
So what happened to the family after he did that?
Insurrection?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Sherry, his wife, Sherry, was living with Gilles Reese. She was owned by Gilles Reese. And the Reese farm was near the Moore farm when it happened at, and Gilles Reese, as her master, was able to protect her and the children. My great-great-grandmother, great-great-great-grandmother, Charlotte, was just a baby. She was born in 1830. This was in 1831 when it happened. So they were protected either by Gilles Reese giving them to the Indians. Some said that they stayed on the Indian reservations. Others said that he moved them to another location. But he were able to protect them. And they were not killed by the backlash of the whites that was running around killing just about any black person they could get their hands on. They definitely wanted to kill off his family.
All right, Luke 12, verse 47, it says, "And the servant that does not obey his master's will, that doesn't prepare, that same servant shall be beaten with many stripes." Nat Turner understood that master in that verse was not talking about the so-called white man. We understand that the so-called white man tainted verses that use that word master and say, okay, he was the master. But no, that scripture is talking about God. Nat Turner understood that. He understood the will of his father. He understood why his people were in that condition that they were in because of their sins. That's why he referred to them as the children of Israel and so forth. Because when you read the confessions of Nat Turner, the other slaves, they thought he was crazy for returning back to the plantation. But he knew that he was ordained for a greater purpose. And that purpose was what? The insurrection. He knew that God was using him for a greater cause. And that greater cause was the insurrection, to try to establish some sort of freedom for his people. That's why he returned. Nat Turner wasn't selfish, because he could have escaped. He could have stayed in the jungle somewhere. He could have tried to flee to one of the northern abolitionist states, but he returned back because he knew that he couldn't rise above his nation. He wanted to free his people.
His head was removed from his body and given over to medical studies. What they did with it, moving the brain and all that is up now. But when the record says it indicates from the sheriff, his bodily remains buried in a pauper's grave, as they did with all other condemned prisoners. At that same jail, and at that same court, there were 17 other people from the insurrection of the slaves who were hanged and buried there as well, including one woman. They used that cemetery to bury anyone who was executed, whether it would be black or white. And it was used for a number of years. And then eventually, when the new courthouse was built, the cemetery was closed down and was paved over and a road was built over. So Nat Turner's lower body was probably buried there. His head was supposed to be taken to the College of William and Mary, where it was given to the medical department where they studied, and the head stayed there for a number of years, and then it was disappeared. No one knows exactly what all happened. There's some other legends. Again, like I say, the legends of Nat Turner started on November the 11th. Everything that has been, for the most part, written out, a lot of legends came out that Nat Turner was not hanged, that he lived in the dismal swamp. That's not true. There was legends in South Carolina and Texas that Nat Turner escaped from Virginia and came down there. There was other legends that Nat Turner lived with the Indians. If you go with, there's some Indian tribes down in North Carolina claim that Nat Turner was on their records of 1850. Indian tribes usually kept census different than the U.S. census. And they say that there's a Nat Turner on one of their censuses in 1850, and that means he would not have died in 1831. We know that's not true either. But the overall teachings of Nat Turner, was not confined. The whites tried to erase any evidence of what he had done. They tried to play down the significance of his insurrection. The abolitionists, particularly like William Lord Garrison, published in almost every weekly and in one of his newspapers something about Nat Turner from the insurrection that had happened at that time. A lot of the other abolitionists that was working in Maryland, New York, they used Nat Turner many times in their speeches. Frederick Douglass quoted Nat Turner many times in his speeches that he gave as the reasons to why slavery had to end. So those were positive portions of Nat Turner. And through the history of it, through the legends, say through his family, his children were hidden, which one of them was my great-great-great-grandmother. And therefore, the legacy of Nat Turner as a genetic legacy did not die either. Okay? The whites could not erase, and so they could not erase his seed. They could not erase what he had accomplished, nor could they erase from them the thoughts of people what his goals and objectives were, because those goals and objectives did become realities later on. So Nat Turner, even though he died on November 11th, 1831, he's still alive well today with all of us here and everyone that you see, not only blacks, but whites, Indian, Asians, everyone else who's come to this country live today because of some of the efforts that Nat Turner did. The religious aspect of it, I would say that black people learn a greater reverence and acceptance of religion. I never studied the history about how did the blacks go about maintaining their religious learnings or teachings after Nat Turner died. I would like to assume that they did continue on. A lot of the churches that are established down there now, they were established by people who did live during Nat Turner's time, who had gotten their freedom. And so there are a lot of black churches down there today that had their beginnings in the 1870s and the 1880s. Those people, in my opinion, did so because of the early teachings that Nat had passed on to them. Whether they did it consciously or unconsciously, when they got their freedom, one of the first things they wanted to do was to set themselves up a place of worship and to follow through with that teaching. So Nat, I think, not only just passed down the desires for people to be free, he also passed on the desires for their religious salvation.
Well, when they built the new road to come through, it went right over top of the father's cemetery. Obviously, that's been almost over 100 years. And they did, when they dug in down to a certain depth, they found some bones. They didn't know who they belonged to, so they put them in a box and they supposedly buried over here. This is the Nottoway River. This is the river that kept Nat from getting into the town itself. That's the Nottoway River. And this thing is part of it is good as a statue to the Confederacy. But over there on that side, over there, somewhere there's a little section, maybe Rick will know exactly where it is. There's a commemoration where they put those bones in a box and then just put them in the ground as a commemoration to all the people who have been buried in the Potter Cemetery. And the road is actually on top of it. So that's the river, and then the swamp, That's where they have the historical society where his sword is kept. And some other artifacts.
Area right here, that's where they hung him.
Yes, over in the little, some of those large trees, the big large pine trees. There used to be a very large sycamore tree there. It's gone now. But that supposedly was the hanging tree. And his body would have been buried in there, in that front. And they built the new courthouse like in 1835. They tore down the old courthouse and also tore down the old jail the way he was kept in. And then they rebuilt the new jail. The jail is on the other side of this building over here. We'll drive right by there. But this is where he was trying to come to. Yeah, the armory in which that he was in, that was hoping to have the weapons in, was kept back over around on this end of the road. So Ned had come here many times, but you'll see from where we were, where we are now, the way he started from, it's about 15 miles. And they made it here within less than 2 miles from here before he was finally turned back. So in that period of time of about 22 hours, a little less than 24 hours, they covered almost 20 miles on foot.
They were on a mission.
Many slave ships came in and out of Virginia, particularly out of Norfolk and Portsmouth. But because we know that Nancy was purchased by Benjamin Turner in Suffolk, which is about 30 miles that became property, he brought her here to Southampton County. He purchased her in March or February 1800. So that means that she potentially could have come in on a ship that was in November and October 1799. Based on a description that she was a medium complected African woman. That was her description that was on a document that survived in there that describes what she looked like. Now, most of the slaves came from the West African regions. They were very dark skinned. Matter of fact, that's what the term Black African. Most Africans were very, very dark. And so they came out of the Gambia regions. I've done research on those where the British, as well as the Portuguese and the Spanish, how they shipped their slaves at various places. So slave ships that were coming to the East Coast, coming here to Virginia, would have been coming from either one of those areas or sometimes from around the west side, the east side of Africa. People from Ethiopia and Somalia region, some of those folks up in there carry a light, kind of a medium brown, olive brown complexion. And I found 2 ships, one that came in October, another one in November. One was called a Jerusalem, and the other one was a Monarch, I think it was. But anyway, those 2 ships had a load of slaves as part of their cargo. It was just a manifest, and it didn't break it down into how many was female or whatever. They just sold them to the docks. Back then, people would come in with a ship. The captain would say, "I got a load of slaves who want them, $50 or whatever." And they would pay for them right there. And then they would take them, as they call them, slave merchants, and then they would sell them to somebody else, who in turn would sell them to someone else, and they would work their way out to the farms and plantations out into the counties. So Nancy could have come in on one of those ships. So she could have already been here, I don't know. But we do know that Benjamin Turner purchased her in that March of 1800, and that was born here in Southampton County in October of that same year.
Good stuff. A lot of information.
Yeah. Well, you can only draw by a lot of things if they're just gaps, and you can say, well, potentially it could have been. Now, following that, we still don't know if she was actually from the East Africa or was she from the West Africa. They just said she was an African slave. Yeah. And that was a designation that usually African, when they said African slave, that means they were not homegrown.
More than likely, she probably was from the West. That's where both of the slaves came from.
That's where most of them came from when they came out of the Caribbean. Because the Portuguese and the British, in 1800, the British and the Portuguese were the 2 largest slave people. And they were averaging right around about 80,000 to 90,000 slaves a year. They were transported out of Africa to the Americas.
Nat Turner understood that the white spirits and the black spirits that in individuals was talking about the so-called white man and the so-called blacks that were enslaved at that time. Okay. Now, as pertaining to the Bible, you have different scriptures that talk about us and Esau, the relationship between Jacob, right, who are the so-called Negroes, Hispanics, and natives of today, and Esau, who's the so-called white man, all Caucasian races on the planet Earth. You have Isaiah 14, verse 21, Revelation chapter 13, verse 10. Nat Turner understood this. All right, that's why he quoted in the book of Revelation, chapter 20, one of his visions, he's talking about the serpent was being loosened. So our understanding of Revelation chapter 20 was totally different from Nat Turner. All right, Nat Turner's understanding of Revelation, the 20th chapter, he thought it applied to that time. But he did know that the serpent was talking about the so-called white man. Just like how today, our native Indian brothers, what do they say? They say the white man speaks with the forked tongue, the mouth of a serpent. All right? So Nat Turner understood this. He had some understanding of the Bible.
And one of the issues that the slave owners definitely recognized that with Nat having religious freedom, freedom to pursue his religion, freedom to learn and to read and write, was something that they definitely saw as a danger. You can look at it and say, well, the question of who am I? The slave owners had wanted to take that away from the slaves. They were not to ask anything about their identity. They were not to have any of the desires of themselves individually. They were only to be people, a property of an animal to do what they told them to do, not to think of their own. That was obviously a danger to that. And so the laws that were concocted and passed by the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, were geared towards trying to erase that. That was a fool's errand. It was a great elimination because there was no way they could control people's thoughts. And many of the slave owners themselves probably violated that. They still allowed their slaves to learn to read and write. You can see that by the end of the Civil War, when the slaves did get their freedom, a lot of them did have education, or they immediately start finding ways to get education. So that was a failure by the white population as well. They could not control the thoughts of man. And they could not erase what Nat Turner had brought out into their face, the needs within the slave owners themselves, to recognize the fact that slaves were people, that we were God's creatures, that we were people deserving to get to the same religion as they had, and that we had the right to the same rights, the same privileges, the same advantages that they had, even though they were adamant and stuck on trying to deny that. In that time period, one of the things that Nat obviously had read about was Gabriel Prosser, that had happened in 1800, to where Gabriel Prosser was betrayed because other people knew about his plan, and they told the whites about what the blacks were going to do. And as they tried to get together, the whites were able to break them up. So that was not the first rebellion. This was considered to be the first successful rebellion, and that happened. It didn't succeed in the overall goal, but he did manage to fire, to have actual firing shots.
Now the Gabriel Prosser rebellion, that was in Virginia as well. So he
Right, that was in
word.
Richmond. Well, but he was that happened in 1800. August 1800. That wasn't born. And Gabriel Prosser was hanged on October around the same time Nat was born. But the stories probably had passed down to him about that Gabriel Prosser was betrayed by other blacks who knew about it, and they told the whites of what was going to happen. So that didn't tell anybody. Over there, what's called the quarters, was where the Nat and his groups were playing on their personality. This used to be a big house building. This was a lot of the white family. There was a house right there. It was called Ripley's Quarter. And the militias were pouring up over there at night. And Ned was in those woods back up over there. And he could have attacked us, but he decided it was too well defended. So they went to another location, ended up at Dr. Blunt's place. And that's where the first slaves fought against him, Dr. Blunt. Dr. Blunt's house was defended by a large contingent of slaves who fought against him with pitchforks, knives. Well, they were fighting for their life if they did. And they really look at it and say, you can't blame them. I mean, if you don't live that way all your life, your family's there, everybody that you know of, someone comes to tell you, I want you to go and lay your life out on the line. We're going to die, but we're going to make things better. And they can't tell you how they're going to make it better. Would you jump up and do it?
No question. I wouldn't know unless I was in that situation.
But they were faced in that situation. They had to make that choice one way or the other.
With the mind state that I have now, I would be on that friendly side.
Yeah, you say, no, I wouldn't do it. But I'm just saying, I don't know if I would have done it. Because
where was that the field Negro and the house Negro going against each other?
Well, they were not really. It was more like a class system. The field workers were the ones that were the newest ones that were brought in. They felt that that was the work that they were only suited to. The people who worked in their homes or worked in the cities, worked in trades, they had been slaves all their lives most of the time. And so they were well conditioned. And therefore, they had learned to be, for the most part, technical. And have learned skills and learned things that they could do other than just work out of the field. So consequently, their jobs were considered to be higher skill. It'd be no different than saying, what's the difference between a guy working on the floor of a manufacturing plant as an assembly guy and the fellow who's working in the assembly plant, working in the office, ordering supplies. They're both factory workers, but one is called blue collar, the other is called white collar. And the guy who does the blue collar work, he's considered to have less education and less skills levels, consequently he gets paid less. The guy who works with the blue collar, he's considered to have more education and consequently more skill. And so he gets paid more. They both come to work at the same time, they both go into the same building, but yet, one wears a white shirt, the other wears a blue shirt. One wears a tie, the other guy didn't wear a tie. So that was the same division that you had. Like, see, that's cotton right there. That was the main crop down here. It's cotton and corn. And so most of the workers worked in the cotton.
The biblical understanding of Nat's vision, he was making reference to what America calls unidentified flying object, but we call it identified flying object, right? So-called UFOs. Nat Turner was making reference to the chariots of God. You can read about that in Psalms chapter 104. Right? Just like Christ said in the New Testament in the book of Acts, he said, behold, the same way you see me going up is the same way I'm going to come back. Those were the lights in the skies that Nat Turner seen. Right? And this was a day vision. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't a night vision. This is what Nat Turner seen during the day that the Most High revealed to him, since he was a prophet of the Most High God.
Listening as a slave, listening to the scripture being told to you by a white master that says, God see you as a soul, as a person, not as a slave. It does not have the same meaning as a black person standing up telling you, who is a slave, that God has meaning for you as a person and you have a soul. So right there, by Nat being a preacher, bringing that to the blacks, it was a contradiction and it was a paradox from what the whites were trying to bring in. Being able to speak the language that they could understand. He could tell them things in which that the whites never could tell them. He could speak in ways in which that the whites would not speak. Even today, when I go to Baptist churches, a lot of times I go around to other places, and you can always see the differences in a white preacher versus a black preacher. Black people tend to be very emotional, very expressive, very gregarious with their feelings inside, and they bring them out in ways in which they really work the crowd up. White tea preachers tend to be cerebral. They tend to be more educational, say more scholarly. They talk about the rights of man. They talk about what God intends, but they don't bring out emotions. They don't give you a good feeling. You walk away that says, yeah, I felt the spirit today. They gave you the message, and that was it. That didn't just give the message. He brought the people in. He got them into got into their soul. And in doing so, yes, obviously he taught against what the whites were teaching. But he was also teaching from the same, they're getting the information from the same book. But he's passing information down to them as he was able to channel. And I often try to say, well, what was it like at a sermon that Nat Turner was being given? I try to imagine myself, say, on a hot July Sunday, sitting out on the grass, being eaten up by bugs, You know, all the people around me are slaves, still hands, and every kind of a characterization of everything else. Most of them cannot read or write or doesn't know anything. And here's this guy up here telling you that you are a child of God, that there's a better way for you, that there's something that's going to be coming to you one day. And he's telling it in a way that which you can understand it. And he speaks it in a way that you can feel it. You know, how would the audience have responded to that, as opposed to sitting in that same spot and a white guy sits there and he reads passages from the Bible and then says amen and then walks away? Obviously, that had a much better effect on the population of the blacks than the whites did. And a lot of white masters probably saw that, and some of them may have recognized it as a potential danger. Others may have saw it as, well, as long as they keep the slaves happy and they pick more cotton, okay. Because to them, it was all about commerce. If they did not interfere with the slaves' work, they were okay with it. I think probably that was more the issue at the beginning. After the insurrection happened, obviously they saw that as a real danger. And that was why a lot of the laws was passed to prevent congregations or prevent people from gathering, and they could only get the readings of the Bible, say, from a white person. They wanted to control that, but they couldn't. And it was an obvious failure on their part as well. So, yes, Nat Turner definitely opposed the established system. But at the same time, he didn't do it in a way where it created conflict. He gave the people what they needed. And in doing so, he elevated them. He rose them up from their humble grounds. He took them out of the dirt, so to speak. And even though they were slaves, they were dirty, they had whelps on their back, they had to go out the next day and do the same thing that they had always done every day. They had a hope in their souls that there was something better, and it was coming. It was going to come in their lifetime. Even though they never happened. It did come in the lifetimes of their descendants.
Nat Turner was making reference to the book of Revelations, chapter 20. All right. He had some pretty, basic understanding of the scriptures. He knew who the serpent was, being the so-called white man, just like our native brothers say the white man speaks with the forked tongue, or has a forked tongue, a snake, a serpent. However, Nat Turner was in the wrong time period. Revelation chapter 20 is talking about after the 1,000-year reign with Christ, but that's going somewhere else. As far as the first should be last and the last should be first, that's making reference to the book of Genesis. When Jacob came out, Esau came out, Jacob took hold of Esau's heel, and also 2 Ezra 6 and 9, where it says Esau is the end of the world and Jacob is the beginning of it that followed.
Okay, and that got the title of general from his soldiers, or from the people who joined with him. He didn't call himself a general, unlike a lot of people that you look back in history that when as soon as they get something started, they give themselves the title of general. He accepted himself as the leader, but he never ever took the title of his own. He said that he was called general by when he rode up after he collected a group of slaves, and he had sent them out in 3 different directions, and then they all met back together again. Now, that again shows his leadership ability, because he sent this group of slaves out on their own and told them a place to where they were to rendezvous, which is the term we use today, and they did so. The directions when he broke them off was at night, and they had to navigate their way through the way he told them to go and find out to get to that location. Because the assumption would be made that the slaves knew where they were going, obviously as Nat did, but even with that, they still could have went in any direction, could have went someplace else. But he was able to collect all of his groups back together. And when those groups had collected back with the slaves that they had brought with them, that they picked up along the way, who themselves didn't know Nat's plan. They didn't even know that the insurrection had started until it came to their house. And then those slaves were able to convince them to go, and they came because of Nat. And when Nat came up and joined with them, that's when they all cheered out and referred to him as General Nat. Then when he went to another location, which he had sent the force ahead of him, and by the time he caught up with them, they had already killed all the white people who were there at the house. They all hailed him as General Nat again. Then the term general was referred to by some of the slaves in their trial when they were captured later on. And that's where the term General Nat came from. But
Ned himself, even in his, I think in his trial, he never referred to himself as a general. He was the leader. He accepted the responsibility of the leader, but he didn't give himself a title. He didn't live there. This is where Ned was believed to have gotten the sword that he had when he was captured. And that, wow. And they were like, and it was took as much as 10 days before the bodies were found. Wow. So they're already decomposed and everything. So all this going pretty bad. Yeah. Matter of fact, the whitehead case, they talk about the white people when they came there, so it that they have discovered that the pigs have been eating on the bodies. The pigs are scavengers, and bees, you know, they eat anything they eat. I'll tell you what you read.
Nat Turner understood the role that he had to play. He understood what he was ordained for, what he was destined for. And like I said before, his role model was Jesus the Christ. And he understood how Christ died for his people. He knew that he had to die for his people. He knew that it wouldn't be a wonderful death. It wouldn't be a pleasant death. He would either be hung or crucified, just like Christ was crucified. And Nat Turner was ready for that. He understood that. Because remember, he ran away from one of his plantation owners. But by him not being selfish, he returned back for his people. And he understood what would be the results of that insurrection. His main objective was to go throughout plantation and plantation, pick up as much resources as he could, resources being free slaves and ammunition and so forth, swords, guns, and knives. However, he did say that he would not going to kill those poor whites that lived among the slave owners who they themselves didn't own slaves. That's why he spared them. But the women and men and children who had slaves, they were put to death.
I could say a little bit, but not really much. I don't think Nat had a lot of information about Gabriel Prosser. It was just in a basic sense of time. 1800 to 1822, when Nat began to start really giving serious considerations to an insurrection. And by 1828, when he put the insurrection, started putting it into his plan. I don't think he carried too much information about Gabriel Prosser. I believe he was given more directions towards what he was receiving from the Bible. Now, there was other things that had happened during that same time period. In 1824, the American Colonization Society started to send slaves or freed slaves back to Liberia. They established the colony of Liberia, and a lot of slaves from Virginia were sent to Liberia, including some out of Southampton County. There's documented evidence. One of the presidents of Liberia, a fellow by the name of Garner, his family was freed from out of Southampton County. And he was born in Liberia, but he became the president of Liberia in 1888. So Nat could have heard about that. He obviously would have been known about words would have probably been passed around through word of mouth from the slaves that if you could get free, you could go back to Africa. But because Nat's direction was geared to freedom here, I don't think he would have followed through with that as an area. Some of the other insurrections in other areas about, other slave revolts that occurred in other areas of the country, including the Caribbean. He might have heard some about that too. But apparently from everything that I've read on that, all of his directions, all of his inspirations for his insurrection came from within himself, from what he said he received from God and from his interpretations from what he read in the Bible. So that's the way it originally looked. Had a porch out on it with the big windows up at the front. There's that window there. And there was a doorway up there too. But this was a real stately house. This is the poorhouse. And the other one was the Reese house.
Now he could have. This is where he could have got the Bible from. Some altruistic or white person could have decided that the Negroes needed the Bible, or the Negro preacher needed the Bible, and gave it to him. But supposedly the white people were listening to him preach because he was so much more better at it than the white people.
A militant mindset instills discipline, order, and structure in men. Okay? Nat Turner understood that. That's why they called him general. And his men were in rank order. They had different ranks. When you read the confessions of Nat Turner, he said how they would always march. They will march from one plantation to the next. They even were riding on horses, all right, which was forbidden during that time, as you see in the movie Django and so forth. All right, the slaves were not supposed to ride on horses. The people that rode on horses were people of high stature, people of position. Nat Turner took this as a sign from God that it was time for him to go forth with his plans of the insurrection. Unfortunately, on the night of the eclipse, it did not happen. Okay. However, what's inspirational and what's divine is that the slave insurrection of Nat Turner occurred on August 21st, 1831. What other insurrection or slave revolt happened during that time? The Haitian slave revolt. Okay? And Nat Turner wasn't even born yet when the Haitian slave revolt started, which was in August 21st, 1791. That's when the Haitians started revolting against tyranny, against oppression from the French Caucasians, and they gained their freedom, I believe, in 1804. Okay, but it started August 21st, the same day that Nat Turner had his in 1831. All right, so I believe that was a divine inspiration of God, that those two slave revolts were on the same exact day.
Referring to his confessions, Nat said that after his last battle, when he realized that all hope was lost, he and two other slaves worked their way back into the swamps near Cabin Pond. And he sent those two slaves out, one was named Davy and the other was Temple, to pass the word around that he would be there at Cabin Pond waiting for any slaves who would join him, just so he could raise another army. After 3 days of waiting there and they didn't return, he assumed that they had been captured. There's no record that they were captured. They probably just went back home. He said after a few days of waiting there, somebody started seeing white people coming around as though they were looking for someone. So he decided that now that everything was lost, so he decided to go into hiding. And he went into an area of the woods near where he originally started from, near the Cabin Pond, and he hid out there in what they call a cave. People think of the term of a cave as being this piece of monolithic thing similar to a cave that you would say in Lieu Cave. It was really just a hole that he dug in an embankment under a tree. And he lived in there for over 60 days, coming out only at night to get food and water and probably to go around the houses. It was also during that time that he most likely had communications with his wife and probably a few of the slaves. But he said that one night when he had been out, he came back, a dog had came into the cave with some food that he had hidden there. And then a few nights later, that same dog came back with some other slaves who were hunting. And they discovered him, and he'd been afraid that those slaves would turn him in. He left that cave and went to another location. He hid out from the army. Again, the militia started looking for him because the word was now had been passed out. A lot of them thought Nat had escaped to the Dismal Swamp. During this whole time of those nearly 70 days that he was out in hiding, no one knew exactly where he was. But no white people knew that he was. They were still looking for him. There was wanted posters out. There were militias on the road every night looking for him. But he managed to avoid them and stay hidden. And on his last day when he was captured, he said he was hiding again from a group of militia when Benjamin Phelps just happened to come across where he was hiding and raised his gun on him. And he said that he felt that it was better to turn himself in to Benjamin Phelps than to one of the militia groups, which was probably a smart move because the militia group probably would have shot him or hanged him right then and there. Benjamin Phelps
took him in to get the reward. And that's how he was brought in for trial. So that's again, those were the actual facts about it. The legends of it was how many places he traveled to, that he went into people's houses and did chop up some more people later on. None of that was true. Who wants to be associated with that? When I was in Africa, a lot of the African people told me, you shouldn't say you're from slaves. You're an American. Because they're slaves.
A slave with the Africans were telling you?
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of Africans look down on American blacks as being beneath them because they're descendants of slaves. And then another one of the girls, Romaine, because she was a Turner. She was one of the black ones. She married a Turner. And then one of the guys, Leslie Turner, who's buried over on that side over there, he was one of the black ones too. He married a young lady whose last name was Turner.
So it's a marriage.
Well, it was, you're in the county out here. I mean, you couldn't go so far. And so you had to take what was available. And they were good looking women. Turtles were some fine looking folks. So they took what was available. We used to have it was that as long as you were not directly first cousin or sister, everything was okay. And what also during that time period too, which was quite common among particularly in the 1930s and 1940s, black families used to do mixing up where they would pick out who you were supposed to marry. Arranged marriages. Right. Because they wanted to maintain a certain quality or a certain trait within the family. The Turners on the light side, on the white side, they were very light. So they wanted to try to match up light to light, dark to dark, or whatever. And so the end results of that's why you had some of them that were sometimes cousins married over to each other. And like I said, now my mother and father, even though my mother and her family's name, my mother's dark. So I ended up being a nice blend in the middle. But my father looks almost white. When he was in the military during World War II, they kept trying to throw him in the white side because the military was segregated during World War II. Wow. And he had to stand up to say no, he was not white. But from looking at him, there was no way you could tell that he wasn't white because his mother is white, my grandmother.
And she didn't deny his black side.
Right. Because Herbert Turner was half white, but Anzella, who was his wife, was his third wife. She was mostly all white, but she was a little bit of Indian. But she looks almost all white. So her children that she had with him were all white, but the children that he had with his other wives were dark. People used to say the average picker was expected to pick over 200 pounds a day. Otherwise, get a good, exceptional picker man to pick 300 pounds a day. So that was usually expected to pick anywhere between 250 to 300 pounds of cotton a day during cotton season. It only comes in once a year. But during the time when it's in, they had to collect it and get it in. Now, during that time, corn was more of the bigger crop than cotton. They did grow cotton out here. And peanuts didn't come until later. Tobacco was a big crop, and corn was the big crop. So the house was right here. The house is right over there. On this side, right over here. Right. When they came out, that was where the house was moved to. That was where it was the slaves that lived there in the main house. So they actually killed them down there. But this was the house that was still here for a long time, but the house that they were actually killed in. The Turners no longer own any of this land over here, not the Francis. So this cotton I just picked from the plantation. Yeah. Yeah, so what you do is the cotton gin, you see the seeds in it? Yeah. Getting the seeds out was the hardest part. That's why you have to have a cotton gin. And trying to pull that seed out during the time on that turn, the cotton gin had just started being developed. And the way you have to pull that seed out of the seed out of there.
So that's what it was getting, the cotton or the seed. That's what they wanted.
They wanted the fiber. You get the seeds out, and then now you could take this. If you take this and start rolling it, you just throw your seeds down and roll the cotton like that. You can make it into a thread. All right. Yeah. See, roll it into a thread. And you keep rolling it and rolling it and rolling it and rolling it till it becomes strong enough as a material. Then they mix it with some type of liquid that makes it stick together. And then you twist it and twist it and twist it.
tighten it, and you can get a fiber. See?
All right, yeah.
And you do enough of that, then you can get a thread with it, and those threads you can weave it together, and that's where you make your cloth. So this is the basis for the textile industry as it developed. It's cotton. So you just keep twisting it, you can make a thread.
So he had to take threads and patterns, and he had to pull the seed out.
Well, before that, yeah, they had other slaves who would use it. The people would pick it out of the field, bring it in. And when it had to be done by hand, as you can see, it was very difficult to get all that seed out. Well, the cotton gin was the first machine that was built by Eli Whitney to mechanically remove the seed. That made growing cotton as a cash crop very profitable. Because back then, this was to try to gin this much field. You usually would get 2,800 pounds, anywhere from 2,800 pounds to 3,000 pounds of cotton per acre. This is about a 48 field right here. Wow. So you're talking 40 times 2,800. So you're dealing with whatever, around about 82,000 pounds of cotton.
I'm thinking to myself, you just going through it, you guys
Just pick it like that.
Yeah, yes.
And they used to pick it in 3 or 4 different phases. As you see, some of it is already out.
Yes.
So in the old days, they would come through and pick it as soon as it started to go out. Then as the other bowls would open up, they would come back and pick it again. They wouldn't wait for it all to come out. Now that they use machines, they have to wait for it all to open up.
All right.
But when it's like that, you run the risk that the weather can go bad on it. Or because it's dry, it can catch on fire and you can lose the whole crop. So slaves just had to come out here and work in this day, sun up to sundown, every day to pick this stuff.
I'm keeping this memorabilia. This is official cotton from the Travis plantation. All right, that Nat Turner slaughtered right here. In my pages.
With the basis for the reason for why Nat Turner was a slave.
Confidence was to be gained. The thought of freedom was to be gained. To inspire the minds of other so-called slaves was to be gained. All right. The slaves at that time, we had to serve out our captivity because it was written in the Holy Bible. All right. Inspiration is a big thing with our people. If we could inspire the minds of one, we can inspire the minds of 1,000. So Nat Turner understood this. Even though he was unable to free all of the so-called blacks that were in captivity at that time, he was able to inspire people, give the people some kind of sense of hope. Nat Turner teaches us a lot today. It teaches us that whatever state we're in, whatever position we're in, we can never rise above our people. One thing that sticks out in my mind about Nat Turner is that he ran away from his plantation. He ran away from his slave master. He left everything. Left his wife, ran away. The reason he came back is he understood the will of his father. He came back for the rest of the slaves. He came back to freedom because that was the will of his father. All right, as pertaining to his visions that he had, his dreams that he had, and from him just researching the scriptures, he knew that he was ordained for some great purpose. You know, a lot of our people, just in society today, a lot of our people they're selfish people. They're out for self. But Nat Turner was about his people. He was ready to put his life on the line because he knew he was going to die. And most of the times when he engaged in conversations with the other slaves, he was discussing death. He knew he was going to die, but he was ready to die for his people. Most blacks and Hispanics today were not ready for that. Our forefathers was on another level. So Lord willing, we're able to reach to be on the level of our forefathers.
One of the things I always do, I consider is my life's work and my contribution to the Nocturnal legend is to pass on the information that I've accumulated over the years to Nat so that the actual fact can be given. As I said, the actual fact of Nat Turner's life was from October 2nd, 1800 to November 11, 1831. The fiction or the history and the myth of the man since that time has been many variations and many, many different ways that people have interpreted or presented that information. Some of it accurate,
Some of it not very accurate. Some of it just plain long out and out false. And some of it even maliciously out and out false. So if I can, through what I've accumulated and passed on and through functions such as this, can educate just a few people with who the real Nat Turner was, then I feel that my goal and my commitment to the Nat and my commitment to my lineage to Nat is fulfilled. So hopefully you guys can use this information, or you all use this information any way you want to, and we'll use it to educate others, pass this information along. Nat Turner was a real person. He was not a myth. He was not a gigantic figure in history that was made up. He really lived. He really died. He had a family. He had goals. He had objectives. He had wishes just like everybody else did. The only thing that made his life so different was he was a slave. And in doing so, he tried to change that condition that he was born into, and he didn't die as a slave. He actually died as a free man because he had killed his owners. Right? And so he was not, even though the state of Virginia did pay $375 to the descendants of Putnam Moore, who was his last owner, they did not own title to Nat Turner. So on the day that he was hanged, November 11, 1831, Nat Turner died a free man. There was a poem that I had wrote years ago, and I sometimes give lecture to people, and Nat was, as far as we know, was not given a decent burial, or the benefit of a burial, nor did the people in the area be allowed to stand around his grave and grieve and anything else. He was, again, the whites tried their best to eradicate him from history, to just say that he was a non-existent, non-person. And I thought that if Nat had been given his opportunity for someone to speak for him, that these were the words that he would probably would have wanted to be said. And so the poem I wrote back in 1999, and if you guys would give me the opportunity, I would like to read that to you so that it could be passed along as well. They're passing it over here. There it is. Okay. The title of the poem is Speak for Me. I would do it from memory, but my memory is, I'm getting older and my memory is not as good. All right. So in case I haven't been it for a while, but again, it says, Speak for me. And this is for Nat Turner, that if he had had a funeral, that if I had been there, I would have read this standing beside his grave. It says, much can be said about me now that the veil of night has drawn its final curtain. How I'm remembered by those yet to draw upon this life is not mine to say for certain. On my legacy, I wish for no long or protracted words be said of my recorded fight. Instead, my children, speak for me to those who follow of the wrongs I tried to make right. To the special men and women who heard my call and answered with bravery and charity of heart, speak for me to them and say, his home, with heaven earned as his lasting reward. On my God, my Jesus, in whom I found the sweetest joys and loving bliss, speak for me to those still bound in darkness, that I strive for them to know him thus. My star has blinked, eclipsed from these mortal skies by newer diamonds of the hour. Please speak for me to each of them and say, freedom will reign in all of their tomorrows. This, I believe, would have been the words that Nat would have wanted the public to know about him, because I believe it states who he was, what he was trying to do, and that he wants to be remembered in history as a man who sought freedom. The incident of the insurrection was just a step to that, and it was a step that needed to be done, but it's a step that we remember. But the other things, the freedoms, the people who carried on, the newer diamonds of the hour, those are the people who follow. I'm one of those diamonds. My grandchildren are one of those diamonds. And I hope your children and your grandchildren will be those diamonds who will receive Nat Turner's freedom.